Okay, that began from the kitchens. So let's welcome Marina Sitrin.
You can hear me without the mic, or should I? Yeah, that has got to be the best introduction by about 1 million that I've ever had, and with the best help. You did steal a little bit of the rupture part I was going to get to, but that's okay. No, we'll get to that. So yeah, I've been participating in the movements from Argentina, New York, and I've also spent time in Greece and Spain. So what I'm going to talk about is kind of grounding most of this in Argentina, what happened 10 years ago, and then kind of bringing it up to today, but then also talking about Occupy Greece and Spain. But we could be talking about experiences in Chiapas, Mexico, or in Oaxaca, or in Bolivia. I mean, especially the last 15 years, these practices that we use in Occupy have roots all over the world and in the US. But I'm going to focus on the places I've been most recently, and just for the sake of focus. So there's actually this passage that I think helps, and I don't usually start things with quotes, but Walter Benjamin, who's a thinker and was an anti-fascist organizer, and died quite a few years ago, but he wrote this passage that I think is so useful in thinking about today. And he was talking about revolutions, and he says, well, Marx said that revolutions are the locomotive of world history, but perhaps things are very different. It might be that revolutions are the act by which the human race traveling in the train applies the emergency brake. So that's actually to start with this kind of rupture idea, but with the no, with this just like, when we look around the world and think about, what you were saying with the ya basta from, which comes from Chiapas in Mexico, the enough, but then also in Syntagma Square in Athens, they had a huge banner saying ya basta, enough, and in Egypt it was kefaya, which is also enough, the same kind of thing, where in Spain, no nos representan, see I'm doing the slogans, they don't represent us, but these different exclamations of just no. I mean, think about, the beginning of Occupy coming out into the plazas, and it wasn't, okay, let's organize and whatever the matter, but it was just that kind of no, stop. But at the same time, Occupy Spain, Greece, Argentina, this moment of no wasn't just no, okay, we're protesting, or no, we're just against. It was the no, and then opening up something new in that space. So these cracks, these openings that create whole new landscapes. So that's a lot more of what I'm going to be talking about. But it's an affirmation. It's not just a no, okay, we reject this. It's no, and then we're the 99%. Or in Spain, is democracia real ya. So no, but real democracy. Not we're demanding real democracy, but we're making real democracy now. So in talking about Occupy Spain, Greece, and then Argentina as well, but the same kind of two basic features I think we have in common around the world, with these three geographic locations, but other ones as well. And it's that, starting with that no, and then in that space of that, yes, organizing in a horizontal way, which we'll talk about in a second as far as Argentina and horizontalidad, but the coming together and looking at one another and saying, okay, so what do? How do we organize? Creating relationships where we hear one another and affirm one another's voice and think together through listening and talking about what we're going to do, so that the horizontal relationships being key, and then that happening in some kind of physical space. In Latin America, people talk about this as territory, kind of using space, and then as you construct things together in that with these relationships, it's making a territory, or creating, if you think about the idea of territory, you're going to defend that space. It's starting out as physical, but then creating something totally different, which I will talk about a little bit later, but that applies, in my opinion, to Occupy not just when we are in huge plazas and huge squares, or in Spain when they're in Sol and in the big plazas, but when we're together creating these relationships in whatever space, what we're creating. So if that's in neighborhoods or universities or schools or wherever, it's this kind of assembly form, and then what we create in that together. Argentina, 2001, going back to the beginning of this economic crisis, also started in a very, very similar way. So first it was just an economic crisis that was getting worse and worse, privatization, the same story that we know too well now, and people around the world have been suffering. And in Argentina in 2001, there's the economic crisis. And people just break. The going out for the Casa de Raso is really significant considering the history of the military dictatorship in Argentina, and people, relationships between people having been really broken down, people not knowing their neighbor, not talking to each other, having a lot of fear. So at first, going out with the banging of the pots and pans, the Casa de Raso is kind of that first step in going out together. And then as people were out in the streets and in the thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, banging pots and pans, and similar to so many of the movements around the world, it wasn't organized by unions or political parties. There weren't posters, or placards, pre-printed with whatever kind of exclamation. It was just people out together, banging pots and pans, and then this song emerged. Not even a chant, but the Que se vayan todos, they all must go, is sung, and it's kind of sung in harmony, and you not sing it. No, but it's, so just to give you a different feel of like banging pots and pans, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, but singing this, que se vayan todos, que no quede ni uno solo, that they all must go and not even a single one should remain. And this popular power in urban areas throughout the city actually forced out a government, and another government, and another government, and another government. It's actually 5 governments in total in a very short period of time were forced out. So then you get to this moment, though, of, okay, so now what? The bank accounts are frozen. There's this total economic crisis. And you force out at least some symbolic place of state in the government. So then what do we do? And that's where the beginning of what in Argentina they call the horizontalidad, which now we talk about horizontalism or horizontal relationships, but in Spanish and in Argentina at this moment, this is the first ever that, at least I could find, where people use this word horizontalidad. And it's a word, but it describes a relationship. And, as Peter was saying, I do oral history, so a lot of my conversations I record, and I would ask so many people, so what is this horizontalidad? I speak Spanish, but I've never heard this word before. And person after person, it was almost uniform. It's like, well, it's this. And of course I'm recording, so like how exactly do you capture, it's this. Well, what is that? Well, it's not this. I mean, it really was kind of like that basic of just, all of you have been participating in assemblies know that like, it's that we want to create this kind of relationship with each other. And that was the beginning of just this, the ya basta, the I'm fed up, the no, to people telling us what to do. They got us into trouble. They, whatever that amorphous they is, but that's what got us into trouble, so we're going to figure this out together and in this horizontal way. And that, I have my watch upside down, which really won't help the time. So that happened in, throughout this form of organization, this trying to figure things out, form of organization and social relationship, happened in these urban areas, which is really the heart of where the Casa de Raso was taking place, the banging of pots and pans. And so people who were middle class or identified as middle class, it's kind of, Argentina, like the US, has this weird, what is middle class is kind of a mushy category. But people who identified as middle class, coming together in the neighborhoods, just looking to one another and saying, okay, so how do we do this? How do we figure out how to survive? And through that emerged incredible barter networks, community gardens, healthcare. People were finding ways to take care of one another in these areas using this horizontal form of the relationship. In unemployed neighborhoods, which are really entire neighborhoods, it's not to talk about unemployment in Argentina or certain parts of the world, especially Latin America, the developing world. It's not to talk about like, oh, you lost your job, but maybe in 2 years you'll get a job. Unemployment is more like a state of being. That you don't have a job, you probably won't, your children probably won't have any regular work. And a lot of these entire neighborhoods are kind of the periphery. Mike Davis writes a bit about this, as well as Rose Sabecci and other people kind of have studied these peripheries outside cities that used to have work and don't anymore. And so are these kind of left neighborhoods that have become these unemployed neighborhoods. And in the late 90s, people who lived in the neighborhoods had started organizing in these unemployed movements, demanding unemployment, organizing, shutting down roads. But in that space, and then this got magnified after 2001 in the economic crisis, in that space of the no, of the shutting down the road, people also began to create these assemblies. And so, okay, what? It's not just a protest. It's about, so what are we going to make? What are we going to do? What are we going to create? How are we going to do that with one another? Using horizontalidad. So now it's like in the urban areas with the kind of middle class identified folks, some working class folks. Urban peripheries way out in unemployed neighborhoods. And then also something that began just a little bit before 2001 with one workplace, and then after it's now up to like 350, are workers taking over their workplaces and running them together with horizontalidad. So bosses sometimes would abandon workplaces or wouldn't pay workers, and workers coming together. This is a slogan Peter also mentioned, Occupy, Resist, Produce, borrowing this slogan from the landless movement in Brazil, which has the same, you occupy, you resist the police, and then you produce in this territory. Well, the territory is the workplace in this case. And all kinds of workplaces. I mean, we can maybe in the discussion get into that more because it's something that's starting to spread in other parts of the world, but you know, hotels, like a 4-star hotel, and bookstores and grocery stores and newspapers and metal shops and ceramic factories. Like, there's a whole real vast array of workplaces that people are recuperating, and using that language that's really important in Spanish, to recuperar, which, to think about recuperate, it's not occupying. I mean, they put occupy in the slogan, but recuperating, which kind of implies it was yours, like you're taking back something that's yours. So recuperating these workplaces, bringing them under production, and the vast, vast majority of them continue to use this horizontal form, making decisions together without power over each other. Also, tons of art collectives and media collectives. I mean, there's just, you know, throughout the country, people organizing, and, you know, why did it happen this way? I don't know. Why were there more than 1,500 assemblies that came up within a short period of time in the United States, you know, in different villages and towns and cities, you know, at a certain moment? Sometimes, you know, we could talk about that perhaps in the discussion, that there are these moments. But in Argentina, you have in all of these different kinds of neighborhoods, class-based organizing communities, this form of organization, horizontalidad. But not just the horizontalidad, coming with that as well is a relationship to and perspective on power. Kind of people in the same, we don't want people telling us what to do, having control over us. I mean, that's institutions of power and the state and everyone who got us into this trouble. It's also not looking to them to solve it, so continuing to look to one another and not, you know, a lot of people have asked if this comes from, you know, X theory or Y, or is it this, or is it anarchism, or is it that? And it was really just people organizing and saying that this doesn't work, this form, these institutions don't work, we need to do something differently, and then calling themselves autonomous. Also not tracing it back to a history of autonomous Marxism or anything else in the world, but just saying we're autonomous because we are doing this ourselves and together, and we don't want the institutions of power involved. And in that relationship, and this to me is also one of the really central pieces, is in this horizontalidad, in this horizontal relationship where you're creating together and autonomously, that process, that relationship of making decisions together, doing things together, something changes in you and in the other person and then in the group as a whole. And in Argentina, people did a lot of reflecting on what was going on and what they were feeling. There's crazy psychoanalysts, and there's more in Argentina, I think, than anywhere in the world, which maybe has something to do with it. I'm not sure why. There was so much reflection on feeling, and people talked about being new subjects in history, being protagonists in history, being actors, and talked about the feeling in all of that and how important that was in what they were doing or what they are doing. Which, you know, I mean, those of us who've been participating in these spaces and Occupy, to just think for a moment about, like, how did that feel? And do you feel different? And when did you feel different? And did it change you? And did it change the group as a whole as you changed? And so this was this active reflection in Argentina about changing social relationships and protagonism and subjectivity, which I'd also love to talk about in the discussion. There's all of the stuff I'd love to talk about. But I'm going to kind of keep going through kind of historically, because as all of this is happening and developing and the relationships between movements, so some of the skill sets that people had in the unemployed neighborhoods would then be brought in and into barter and exchange with people in the more urban areas. So everything from electrical work being kind of brought into certain areas, and then medical attention kind of going out to the periphery. And so there's all of these kind of horizontal exchanges between people in different movements, which is quite unique to have happen. So you can imagine this whole landscape of real transformation and alternatives taking place. So meanwhile, though, kind of back to the state that was put on hold and kicked out, there was, and I won't go into all of the details, but there was an election, and people were saying they weren't probably going to vote. You know, this is going back still to just, you know, a year or 2 years after the popular rebellion. And a lot of people were saying, no, not only are we not going to vote, we're going to have massive assemblies in the street and show that this is where democracy is and what we're doing. And then one of the people brought in is Menem, who is someone who was responsible or held kind of symbolically responsible for a lot of the privatization in Argentina that led to the crisis. And so then it becomes a different kind of conversation in the movements of, well, this guy is so terrible that maybe we should vote for this other guy, Kirchner, because the other one is so terrible. It sounds kind of familiar, right? It's like, we don't want to have anything to do with this, and then they start to bring in someone who's so horrible that it kind of sucks you back into the conversation. So this happened in Argentina. Not a huge amount sucking people back into the conversation, but enough that it began a kind of process of what became more and more disorientation, I think, in the movements and incorporation into the state. So Kirchner wins, and one of the main things a government, any government would want to do is like, what do you do when hundreds of thousands or millions of people aren't really paying that much attention to you? You've got millions of people in a barter network, workers are running workplaces, unemployed, have gardens and building schools and building homes on occupied land. Like there's this whole parallel thing going on, but it's not just parallel, it's quite a serious power that's getting created. So the state was quite aggressive in trying to get the movements either to kind of come in under the state or at least pay attention to the state, make it a point of reference again, or then they would just repress the movements and kind of alternated between these. But the trickiest one was actually trying to get the movements to work within the state. So many, I mean, it's still a serious economic crisis, and movements, needed food and basic things. And so then you would have municipal governments or higher levels of the government offering movements things. Well, we'll give you, X amount of food each week. Do you want it? Do you not want it? It seems crazy not to accept it. But then all the terms that come with it. So it was both, do you take it, not take it, all the terms, but even just the process of that conversation. And this happened in movement after movement. Instead of like, okay, what is our agenda? We want to talk about deepening the barter network, or we're talking about running our workplace. And then here come all of these proposals, and some of them sound good. But it's not what if we came up with an agenda here and then someone knocked on the door and said, hey, I'll give you each $50 to meet in my space. We'd probably have an hour conversation about whether or not we're going to meet in that other space and each take $50, and we forget to talk about Argentina and social movements. So it's that kind of diverting the conversation that was happening quite a bit. And there are a lot of examples of that. And then there was also just some very legitimate that the past governments hadn't. Not only had they not talked about human rights, but after the dictatorship, and this is like 30,000 people are murdered in society, and there's this culture of silence and not to talk about it. Then the government passed a law when they had democracy in 1983, and people do this is not just my doing, people in Argentina, when they talk about the democracy that came about, put it in quotation marks. Because it's like, well, democracy, okay. But it was this kind of forgive and forget. There's this law that's passed, Ley de Punto Final, and it's basically saying, let's all be nice with each other, and just kind of move past it. Which included like so many of the people who participated in the tortures and the murders, just living in society. The group Hijos that you talked about, and I would also love to talk about because of they're children of the people who disappeared. And they organized in a really particular way that's significant, and I think foreshadows a little bit of some of this experience in organizing in 2001. But the new government comes in and they do say, okay, now we're going to start to punish people. So again, which is a good thing, but the group Hijos and some of the other groups and movements were already finding ways to try to change the conversation in society. So you have the government on the one hand saying, no, but now we'll take care of it and we'll get the bad guys. Meanwhile, Hijos has been organizing in the neighborhoods to do education around, who are the people who live here that they use the language of genocide, who committed genocide. They do the research and find out who they are, they do the popular education, and would do actions at their homes. But it wasn't so much about the action at the home, it was speaking to society and the community. It's called scratching. So that, on the one hand, they're organizing in a particular way in society. And then the government comes in and it seems good. Of course, a government should punish people who commit genocide, right? But if you've been organizing in the community and then the government comes in and says, okay, now you, Hijos, can be a part of the decision-making in how to punish, which then kind of takes you out of the community organizing you've been doing, or at least you have to make that choice if you're going to do that or not. So these are just a few of many, many, many examples, and I think, again, it's a whole chapter in the Everyday Revolutions, but it's a really important conversation because as our movements build stronger and stronger, and in the US and in other parts of the world, there will be that greater tension with the state, and it will sometimes be the ugly, repressive side that we're used to seeing, and then it'll sometimes be this other side that's really confusing. So I think there are a lot of important lessons to learn from all of this. But I'm going to jump, and so actually no, I do want to say one more thing, because I kind of left it at a lot of disorientation in the movements, which is true, but then in the last, say, 2 years, some of the more autonomous movements have started to recognize a lot of that more and say like, okay, well, how can we, and change a little bit. So at first, in the autonomy and concepts of power, it was very much we want nothing to do with the state. And in fact, a lot of the unemployed movements who had at first won these unemployment subsidies in around 2003, 2004, 2005, so we don't even want your unemployment subsidies. Like, we want nothing, no relationship with the state. And it was after that there was all of this kind of disorientation with the state. And now a lot of the movements are saying, well, wait a minute. Maybe what the state has, not even maybe, but what the state has is ours. So is there some way that we can get what's ours, but keep our own agenda? So we don't take the $50 to go next door and have an assembly about it. We say slide it under the door and we're going to keep our meeting or something, just finding different ways. So movements are struggling to do this in really creative ways. So some of the unemployed movements, for example, rather than taking cash, organize projects. And so they come up with their list of, okay, we need cement, we need flour, we need sugar, we need whatever, certain materials. And sometimes they get them, and sometimes they don't. But if they don't, it's not a life or death question like getting food that's already made or cash. So trying to figure out how to maintain your own agenda and yet take from the state what's yours. So rethinking that relationship, and I think there's a lot there that we can learn from. So now jumping ahead in time, I mean, it's just incredible that all of this and like thinking about the forms of organization and what people have been doing, this is 10 years ago. So now jump to Occupy Spain and Greece, which are 3 places that I think are the most similar around the world and where I've been spending time. And it's that same no. Where in Argentina it was the no. I mean, this is, I think, our no, or at least I can speak for me, but it feels very much like it's that no against the crisis, against an economic crisis. But it's also against a political crisis, a social crisis, a cultural crisis. I mean, this feeling, the slogan in Spain, the no nos representan, in Russia, they have a very similar slogan, but in Russian, the word for represent, they also use a word that can mean imagine. So it's like, you don't represent us and you can't even imagine us. Like, it's this, I think this no in what we're experiencing around the world is against a system and it's not even, it's bigger than just a break in, oh, it's a bad crisis, it's bad politics. I think the whole question of what is democracy is an issue, and that what we have in power here, Spain, Greece, isn't really democracy. You can't be separating the politics from the economics, doesn't really work, from the cultural from the social. So I see it as actually a rejection of a form of democracy as well. And then what we're manifesting in so many places around the world. I mean, to be in Zuccotti Park, or to be in, when there were the big occupations in Sol or in Sindagma, we have differences. In Greece, they hate all little hand signals, like, hate it. But it's the same, massive assembly, people talking to each other, hearing one another, actively trying to make decisions with forms of direct democracy. Seeing it as a relationship, not just a thing, but that process of making decisions together as a relationship, seeing our point of reference as each other. I mean, I know we got a lot of heat in the Occupy movement for, you don't have demands, and what is it to not have demands, but and it's not that, of course, we want economic crisis to end, we want healthcare, it's not wanting things, but where are we looking? And I think, and that's also really consistent with Argentina, is that looking to one another. So where I think we see that happening now is, for example, like in the movement around housing in so many places around the United States. And Spain is actually very similar in the movements against foreclosure and against eviction. And it's not that we don't want the banks to give better deals or renegotiate mortgages, but in so many of the spaces where people are organizing, we're looking to each other. People are knocking on their neighbor's door and saying, are you in danger of being foreclosed on, or might you be evicted on? What can we do? How do we do this, neighbor? And in so many of these places, the places where it's been successful, neighbors come together, block the home, don't allow the eviction to take place. And then sure, maybe there's a negotiation. In fact, most of the time there's a renegotiation with the bank. So it's not that there's no relationship, but it's not a demand of we're gonna go bang on the bank and that's where our demand is. It's we're gonna keep the neighbor in their home and then figure out kind of the other stuff. So it sounds like playing with words a little bit, but I think it's really important, and it's linked to this assembly form of looking to one another as far as where change happens and how we make it happen, and then figuring out the other pieces. In Greece, the movements, I guess, was I gonna wait? Yeah, no. I mean, in Greece, what a lot of the neighborhood assemblies, this was something I was gonna say a little later, but maybe it's important to clarify now, because again, Greece, Spain, the US, all have a very similar phenomenon of we all started in the huge squares and plazas, whatever, depending where you are in the world, what you call it, but whatever your central space is, having a big assembly for a town, for a city. And then in each place, anywhere from like a few months to many months into it, whether it was the police evicted us, or in Spain, they had a 24-hour, 100% consensus assembly, which to me does not actually sound like the most fun. But after meeting for 24 hours in Madrid, in Puerto del Sol, thousands of people, they decided that the mass assembly was actually not the most effective way either to have the democracy that we're talking about, like really hearing one another and being able to talk, or to be able to really meet needs. And I think even though in some places we were evicted, or weather or different circumstances made it so we weren't any longer in the large square, that moving into neighborhoods in other areas makes it more effective. Well, kind of effective and affective, that we can build closer emotional relationships and know one another more, and probably have similar issues going on if we live closer together, or if it's a workplace kind of assembly, or a school assembly, so people coming from similar places. And it's just, we know where each other are coming from, we'll meet each other more, and then our problems will be more similar. And this has been consistent. I mean, how is it this way? Why is it this way? Why is it all happening at the same time? I mean, these are questions I'll raise and throw out to everybody for the discussion, because I don't know exactly why it's happening in such a similar way around the world. But it is just remarkable to be in Greece, and even just in Athens, there are dozens and dozens of neighborhood assemblies, because it didn't work in Singapore. People are organizing in their neighborhood around basic needs. So an example like our housing in Greece is healthcare used to be free. Greeks don't make very much money a month, and with the economic crisis now, they're making it in the hundreds of dollars as an average wage. It's 50% unemployment for young people. I mean, it's this dismal situation. So to add a €5, like a $7 amount of money you have to pay every time you go to a hospital is a huge thing. So people aren't going to hospitals. So that was one of the main issues that kept coming up in neighborhood assemblies throughout the whole country, but I'm going to talk about Athens more. So the neighborhood assembly said, okay, so what do we do so people can get health care? And they would talk to the doctors and the staff in the hospital and make sure people kind of knew what they were planning to do. And they do this regularly in cities and towns all over Greece now. And they go into the hospital, and the assembly blocks the cashiers. Because you would go in and you pay the cashier, and they give you a ticket, and you take it to the doctor that says you've paid, you can get health care. And so they go in, and instead of making it a confrontation with the hospital, they just block the cashier. So it's not even up to you as a person going into the hospital. Your health care is free because the assembly now is in charge of the cashier. And sometimes the assembly even will write the note to the doctor, the assembly has given you permission, whatever, says that you can get health care. And so that is another kind of like the foreclosures, this example of, do people in Greece want healthcare to be free? Absolutely. Is that a demand? I guess. But it's not starting out with we're going to keep marching on the Parliament building demanding that we have healthcare. It's we're going to make it so we have healthcare, use our assemblies to make it happen. And then, and actually in some places, maybe the state will change. They've done it around in Spain around housing. Because people have been mobilizing in this way. There's some municipalities where the municipal government has decided it's in their interest to maybe not order the police to carry out evictions. But that came from neighbors blocking houses and not letting the evictions happen anyway. So kind of looking again at where we're locating power in a different way. And so, I think now as we, having been in some discussions earlier today about the elections, and thinking about the elections in Argentina and how we engage with institutions of power or not. And I think one of the really key lessons we can learn from the experience in Argentina is about maintaining our own agenda. So regardless of people vote or don't vote or whatever, but like, what is our agenda? What do we want to be doing? How do we continue to create that and maintaining whatever that is in our neighborhood or school or workplace or wherever? And I think I'm going to stop now because I've just kind of put so much out there that I'd rather have a conversation than this. Like,